Hi and welcome to another video. In this video I'll be covering one of the two primary modes that we'll be working in when we are modeling in Blender edit mode. We'll also be talking a little bit about the three main ways that you can transform your model, so we got a little bit of a journey ahead of us. In the last video I talked about my personal preference, the basics of navigation and selection, so check that video out if you want to get up to speed. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about modes in Blender. But what is a mode in Blender? You can find a mode menu here in the top left of your viewport. The simplest way I can explain each of these modes is that it's a different tool belt that you put on. So if you put something on like edit mode, you're wearing your construction belt, and this is what you would use to change the look of your model. But if you were to put something on like texture paint mode, this is where we would get out all our brushes and pencils to paint on the model. There's of course more to it than just this, but that should give you a little bit of an idea of what modes are. Let's start out by talking a little bit about object mode, because that is the default mode that you load into when you open a new file in Blender. And I've made a little template for me to explain this better. So we are currently in object mode, and just to give you an idea of what object mode is, it's essentially our decoration mode. It's where we place objects around in our scene and manage our file. But we don't change the look of any of models, so right now I'm basically just decorating my scene with each of my models. And that's essentially what object mode is, decoration and managing mode. But let me go back to a default file here, because next up I want to talk about edit mode. In order to switch to edit mode, you have to first select the model that you want to edit, and then you go up here to the mode drop down menu and select edit mode. You can also go between object and edit mode by pressing the tab button on your keyboard. When you enter edit mode, it's sort of like we are opening up the model and we can change every little part of it very manually. This is one of the things we'll be looking into today, the very basics of poly modeling. So now that we are in edit mode, you can see I don't select my whole object when I click on it, but I rather select small parts of it. If we look close, you can see the model is now constructed out of these little points here. 2 points make a line, and multiple lines makes up a surface. The points here are called vertex, the lines are called edges, and the planes here are called faces. And this is what all models are made out of. These are the things that we can interact with and change the look and construct our model. In order to choose if you want to select vertices, edges or faces, you can go up here to the top left of your viewport next to the mode drop down menu, and you can choose which selection mode you want to be in. If you want to be in multiple modes, you can hold down Shift and click on another button. That way you have multiple selection options available. Or if you want more precision, you can also just click 1, 2 and 3 on your keyboard to go between the three modes. 1 represent vertices, 2 represent edges, and 3 represent faces. Now, the reason selection is so important to know before we start digging into modeling, because a lot of the modeling is based on what you have selected. Not in all cases, but in a lot of them. And I think we've covered the most basics way that we can select every part of our model. But the next thing I want to talk about is the most fundamental of changing the look of our model. There is essentially 2 ways that we can manipulate our model. One of them is by changing what's already there. And the other way is by applying more points, edges and faces to our model. Over here to the left you can see we have a set of buttons. They're divided into groups, as you can see, with a little bit of space in between some of the buttons here. One thing to note here is that these buttons here changes depending which mode we are in. So what you are seeing here is currently the tools that we have available when we are in edit mode. Up here we have the selection tool. The next group here is our transform gizmos. Here we have our annotation and measuring tool. And the last group here is our modification tools. In today's video I'll be focusing on the transform tool up here and the modification tools down here, as those are the primary tools that we use to change the look of our model. But let's have a look on how we can change what's already there by moving, rotating and scaling. If we look at the panel over here to the left, we have these 4 buttons here. This is our moving tool, our rotation tool, our scaling tool, and our transform tools. So let's take a look at how these tools works. The first one we have here is our moving tool, and if we click on it, you can see this little moving gizmo appear on my current selection. I essentially have 3 things I can click on here. 1 is the arrows here, 2 is the plane, and 3 we have this white circle here. The arrows will move in one direction here, following the Z, X, and Y direction. And if you have a hard time knowing what is X, Y, and Z, you can go up here to the top right of Blender and you have a little bit of an indication of what direction is what. One thing to note is that X is always red, Y is always green, and Z is always blue. You can always look to this if you want to know which direction X, Y, and Z is. A nifty little thing to keep in mind. Now back onto the gizmo here. You can also see we have these little square planes here. Those are aligned with 2 of the arrows on the gizmo, because if we click on it, it will move in the 2 arrows direction that it's parallel to. So in this case, the blue square will move in the X and Y direction. So the last thing we have here on the gizmo is this little white circle here. When I click on it, you can see I'm kind of moving in a very freeform way. And we don't have the same precision as we did when we were using the arrows. I honestly rarely use this white one myself, as I prefer the other methods, as it gives me greater precision when I'm moving objects around. One thing to note about this white one though, is that it's based on your point of view. So if I'm moving it here, you can see I move the object sideways based on my point of view, although if I see it from here, I still move it sideways based on my point of view. Typically, colored gizmos move in a set direction, where white gizmos moves based on your point of view. Now before I move on to the rotation gizmo, I just quickly want to mention there are shortcuts for all these that you can do with a press of a button, and you can combine shortcuts to have the same kind of precision as you did with the gizmo. But I plan on doing a little quick tip video that I'll add to my Blender playlist if you would like to speed up your workflow, but in this video I want to keep it simple and not overload you with information. But now let's have a look at the rotation gizmo, and we can get that by clicking the next button over here to the left. You can see the rotation gizmo looks a little bit different from our moving gizmo, but if we take a closer look at it, it kind of makes sense. First up, we have these 3 lines here which all move in a fixed direction. This is personally one of the rotation options that I use all the time. Next one, we have this white circle all around the gizmo, and it functions a lot like the white circle that was on the moving tool, but in this case it just rotates instead of moving based on your point of view. Again, this white circle doesn't have the greatest precision, and if you are a complete beginner, I would advise you from not using the white circle too much as of now. And lastly, we have one more rotation option, but you can't really see it just by default. You actually have to hover your mouse over here in the center and you can see this little white sphere appearing. For this transform option to make sense, I want to select my whole options just to give you a proper preview of how it functions. By clicking on this sphere, we get the trackball rotation. It's a very freeform way of rotating your object. And when we click and move our mouse around, it's almost like it's a ball that we are rolling our finger across. I personally use this option quite a lot, as it's really great for posing your object that is not placed on top of the ground, and it's just a very organic way of quickly posing and rotating something. But for now you know that it's there, but I would highly recommend just sticking to the color rotation gizmos until you feel a little bit more confident working with all these tools. That was the basics of the rotation tool. Now let's have a look at the scaling tool. The next button here is the scaling option, and you can see it has this little arrow at the corner of the button. It's because if I click and hold my mouse on it, you can see it has 2 different options in terms of scaling. We'll be taking a look at both of them as they are very useful in their own way. But the first option here is a gizmo that looks a lot like our moving tool, so let's start out by looking at that. So you can see here on the scaling gizmo we have these colored arrows like we did on our moving tool, but rather than having arrows on them, they have a little cube. And that's a good little indication so that you don't get confused if you're using the moving or the scaling gizmo. But they do work very much in the same way. Let me select the whole object here. The color line scales in a single direction based on X, Y, and Z. And like the moving tool, the planes here scale in 2 directions based on the line that they are parallel to. So you can see a lot of the gizmo function very much in the same way. So you can see that we have this white circle around the scaling gizmo as well. There's really not a whole lot to this last option, because it basically just scales in all directions at once, so that's pretty straightforward. And that's really all there is to the scaling gizmo. So let's go over here and take a look at the next scaling option, which is the scaling cage. and it functions a little bit different from the other transform gizmo that we have played with so far. When we have selected something, you can see that it encages our selection with this box with some little points around it. The neat thing about the scaling cage is that it sort of functions a lot like a lot of 2D tools that some of you guys may be familiar with. Let me try and demonstrate something in 2D because it's going to be easier to understand here, and then it's going to be easier to translate that into 3D after. So I got this lovely picture of a little kid in a red shirt, and he's super excited for me to demonstrate the transform tool for you guys. When I click on one of these squares here, I can drag my selection around in a more organic and freeform way. The cube at the opposite side of what I clicked on becomes my focus point, and you can see I scale towards that point. If we go back to Blender here, you can see that is the case here as well. So if I click on this point here, the point in the opposite direction would be this one down here. And you can see that I scale towards it. You can also select smaller bits of your model and use it as a way of kind of freeforming your model around like this. I have to admit, I personally don't use this a whole lot myself, but it's good to know that it's there and how it functions. But who knows, perhaps one of you can find it very useful. Lastly, I just quickly want to mention the fourth button over here to the left. This is our transform gizmo, and it's essentially our army knife. It's all the three gizmo tools combined into one. You can see that we can both move, scale, and rotate our object. And it's very handy to have rather than having to go and switch between the other three gizmos. Although there are a few tiny downsides to this transform gizmo over using the three main gizmos. One is that you can see it's kind of taking up quite a lot of space here, where the main gizmo doesn't look as intrusive. And another downside is that you are actually missing a few options here. If we just take the moving as an example, you can see we don't have the planes anymore to move in two directions. So although you have all three tools in once, you are just missing a few options. These are obvious things that you can get by and are not such a big issue that you can't use the transform tool at all. In fact, it's really nice if you just quickly gotta move, rotate and scale. And then when you need more precision, you can use that one tool that it is you need. Now, like I mentioned earlier, you can do all these things with a press of a button on your keyboard. And I'll make a little unscripted video that I'll attach to the playlist where I go into depth about these shortcuts. But now you should know the basics of how to start modifying bits on your model that you already have there. And with that said, let's move into a brief introduction of all the editing tools over here so we know how to actually add more to our model. So over here to the left you can see we have a bunch of buttons. Some of them are green and some of them are pink. The difference between the green and the pink are the green add more to your model, meaning that it creates new points on your model, where the pink one changes parts of that selection that you have with some kind of modification. I won't be covering all these tools in this video, but I'll cover the most important ones that you'll be using most of the time. And the ones I don't get to look at today, we'll take a look at in another video. The first button we have here is the Extrude Region button. When we select a part of our model, you can see this yellow plus arrow appears. Clicking on it will make me extrude out new points on the model. And this is one of the most common ways of adding more mesh to your model. With the extrude, you can also have multiple selections and shoot out multiple parts of the model. And you can see that it extrudes along the axis of this yellow arrow plus sign. Now if we go over here and hold our mouse button on it, you can also see we have a few other extrude options. I would say the only one that's really useful for you at this time would be this Extrude Individual. You can see here if I select multiple points now and start extruding out, you can see that they are not tied together, where if I use the normal extrude region and I would extrude the same selection out, you can see it's all tied together. These are some of the main ways that I create more mesh for my model that I can then later select and change. That is essentially the most basic of polymodeling. But we got some more buttons to look at too. The next button we have over here is the Insert Faces button. If we click on it, you can see we have something that looks a little bit similar to the Extrude gizmo. But this time when we click on this and start dragging, we'll basically insert a face within the face itself that we could potentially later go and extrude to make a hole. And here we almost have a very square bucket. Man, it's almost like we are recreating Minecraft here. But essentially what the Insert Faces does is that it creates a loop within a loop. And you can use this in many different ways to modify the look of your model. Now the next button I want to take a look at over here is the bevel button. When I click on it, you can see the gizmo doesn't change, but we are doing a new type of modification. So when I start dragging on this, you can see that my selections get split and kind of curved a little bit. Now I can scroll on my mouse wheel while I'm dragging here to soften out the curve. But essentially what this does is that it takes an edge and then it smoothens it out. You could do this to the whole model to get this kind of cute little smooth box. Now the next tool I want to take a look at here is our loop cut tool. See, when I click on it, there's no gizmo appearing like the other modular tools, but rather this time something is appearing when my mouse hovers over my model. This tool is not based on your selection, but rather where your mouse is. And you can see when I click here, I create a piece of edge loop around my model. And I could then take that new created edge loop here, select the top part, and boom, we have a little house. Now the next tool I want to take a look at here is our knife tool. And like the name applies a little bit, it can be quite dangerous to play around with as a beginner. But I'm going to explain what it does anyway. But I highly recommend trying to avoid using this tool too much. Anyway, so what it does is that wherever I click on my model, I can create points right onto the face that I click on, or an edge. And you can see here I'm basically just clicking on the model and making points. In order to confirm my current cut, you then press the enter button on your keyboard. And you can now see that I've created all these edges and vertices on my model. Now what I've done here is kind of bad in a way. There's something in 3D called edge flow. And a way to demonstrate if you have a good or bad edge flow is that if you take the loop cut tool here and you try and hover it over something and it doesn't loop all the way around, you have essentially broken the model a little bit. You can still use the model if you want to, but this is just something to be aware about, that using the cut tool destroys the flow. And at this point I would recommend, if you use the cut tool, only do it to cut between two specific points. Because if you ruin the edge flow of your model, it can be really hard to work with later on. Now there's a little more to the whole edge flow than just that, but I just want to point out that the knife tool basically just creates points straight on the model, but if it's done wrong, it can then be a bit hard to further work with your model. Now I won't be talking about the next two buttons here in this video. As you can kind of see, the further down we get with these green buttons here, the more difficult they get to use. And if the knife tool is a bit hard to handle for a beginner, these two would be even more hard to use. So for now I would say use the extrude, insert faces, bevel and loop cut tool to start doing some low poly modeling. But I do want to talk a little bit about this pink tool down here called smooth. When I click on it, you can see I get this yellow gizmo like some of the other modification tools. And if I click on it, it's kind of like I'm just scaling a little bit. So in order for this tool to make more sense, let me try and take my loop cut tool here and cut a few loops around my model. Then go back to the smoothing tool, select everything and try and smoothen it out. You can then see that it's trying to kind of soften out my selection. And this is a nice little tool to have if you want to try and make something a bit more organic. Earlier I talked about with the rotation, moving and scaling tool that they all have shortcuts and alternative ways that you can manage them. The same goes for a lot of these tools over here to the left. But I think what you know now is pretty good for a beginning point. And then in the next video we'll be digging more into some low poly modeling. But before I end this video off, I think it could be fun if we make a very simple little model with some of the new tools that we just learned about. The first thing I want to do is go up to Files and create a new general template. And I think it could be fun if we recreate something like this. Now, before I start editing the model, I just quickly want to mention the approach I'm going to take on this model we are making is probably not how I would do it personally today with my level of knowledge. This is just a demonstration to kind of help you understand how these tools are working and how you would use them. With that said, let's just get right into it. So the first thing we got to do is go up here and change into edit mode. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here so you can see the box a little closer. Now I want to start with this part down here. So I'm going to go into scale mode here. And I'm just going to kind of scale it out here in the one axis to make it a little more wide. And I think I want to shrinken it a little bit so it's not as tall. Now I want to go into the insert faces tool here. Make sure that I'm in face select option. Click the top face here. And just insert a little face like this. Next up, I want to make the blade itself. But before we do that, I think the blade will be way too wide if we extrude it like this. So I'm gonna undo this, go into my scaling option again, and just scale this inward a little bit. And maybe slimming it up a bit as well. And now we can go into our extrude tool and extrude out the blade. Now the sword is very square right now. So I think one thing we want to do is take our edge loop here and just make 2 loops here. One on this side and one on this side. Then I'm going to select my scaling tool again. But I want to select each of these corners here of the blade. And then I want to use the blue plane here to scale them only inwards. Next up, I want to go up here and take my vertices selection. And I want to take my move tool and select the top vertex here. And I'll just drag it up. And then I want to take this vertex right here and the one on the other side and drag those up a little bit as well. Now the next thing I want to do is kind of make the top part here a little bigger. So I'm going to take my face selection option and select all the top faces here on the sword. Go into scaling and scale it along the x-axis here. And that makes it a little more cartoonish. Now let's take a look at the bottom part here of the sword. This is very square as well. So let's take all these corners here of the bottom part and scale those along the blue plane as well. Now it has a little bit more of a curve to it. Now I want the top part here to be a little bigger than the bottom part, just to give it a bit more cartoonishness in my case. So I'm gonna hold down Shift and Alt while selecting this edge here. And you can see I select all the edges all around here. And this is a loop that we are selecting. Then I'm just going to scale it along the blue plane again. And you can now see that it looks a little more fun to look at. Now let's make the handle down here. So I'm going to go into face select and then select these 4 faces here. And then we're going to select the insert faces tool. And I'll just insert a face like this a little bit. But if I extrude this out now, the handle is going to have a weird shape. So rather than having to fix that later, I'm going to undo this and try and make this circle the shape of the handle that I want it to be. So let's scale it along the x-axis here. See, we got a nice round circle there. And we can go in and now extrude this out. And you can see we got a pretty good handle there. Now I think we can make this a bit more interesting if we decorate the bottom part here. So I want to go into my loop tool again here. And then I'm going to make a loop here, but while I'm clicking down my left mouse key, I also drag it down to select where I want the loop to be. So I'm going to place it right here. And then I'm going into the extrude tool again, because I want to have this sort of outer thing here on the bottom part. So I'm going to go into face select. And then if I go up close here, hold Alt and Shift while clicking on the edge here, it's going to select all the faces all around the sword here. And I can now extrude these out. But wait, this looks a little weird. That doesn't extrude outwards. That's because we have to go into one of the other extrude modes. So I'm going to select the one here called extrude along the normals. And you can see that they now all extruded out straight from where they were facing. Now that's all good and fun, but it looks super flat and I want this to be a little more roundish. But with the tools we know, the way I think I'm going to go about it is by selecting these faces here, select my moving gizmo, drag this down a bit, hold down Alt and Shift and click on the edge here to select the loop and do the same above here. And now I'm going to click on this pink button down here, this moving. And I'm just going to drag and kind of smooth this out a little bit. If you want this to be bigger, you can simply just take your scaling tool now and click on the white part. But it's a little bit off here as you can see. So I want to move this down a little bit. And maybe use the smooth tool a little bit again perhaps. How about we make something that makes it have a little more grip? So I'm going to take my loop tool here, click with my left mouse button here and just make a few loops around it. Then I'm going up and select my scaling gizmo and I'll make a loop select here with Alt and Shift and just have these two selected. And then if I scale out with the blue plane from here, you can see it looks like it has a little bit more of a grip to it. And that's basically going to be our little sword here that we have made. Probably not the most complex model, but pretty good for a simple start. Alright, so let's have a little bit of a recap of what we learned in this video. So we talked a little bit about different modes. We learned a little bit about object mode and edit mode. When we enter edit mode here, we talked a little bit about that a 3D model is made out of vertices, edges, and faces. We talked a little bit about the panel over here to the left and some of the tools that it offers. Some of those tools were the moving gizmo that we can use to move objects, rotation to rotate objects, and scaling to scale. Then we talked about the extruding tool here that we can use to shoot out more mesh on our model. We talked about the insert faces that we can use to insert a face within a face. We also talked a little bit about the bevel tool here, which we can use to soften some edges. Then we talked about the loop cut tool here that we can use to make loops in our model, that we can then later modify in various ways. And then we talked about the smoothing tool here that we can use to smooth out things that might be a little too bulky. Now what we did in today's video is quite simple if you have any experience with 3D. And the reasoning behind this video was to make people confident we start moving into something a bit more complex soon. In the next video we're going to take a little bit more look on modeling. We'll also try and do some texturing in the most simple way possible. Now these videos are completely free for everybody to watch, so if you want to support in any way, I've left some links down below that you can use. And with that said, I'll see you in the next video. Bye!
To be continued!